Okay, good morning, everybody. Normally, we would give a couple minutes to let people filter in, but we really want to stay on time since we have a full agenda of presentations and we have our fellows here ready to go and talk about all of their wonderful research for the summer. So I can't believe we're here the last day. It's been a great 12 weeks with this group of students and the mentors. We've really enjoyed working with all of you. We're really excited to hear about all the progress that they made over this time. But a huge thank you to all of them for all of their hard work and for becoming such a wonderful part of our community over the summer. We can't thank you enough for spending that time with us, and to the mentors for all of your coaching and your mentoring that you did with them on their projects. We really appreciate that investment of your time. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in. I'll be just quickly introducing the presenters. They'll tell you their title and their name. And we will have time at the end of each of their presentations for questions. So if you could just hold till the end, we would appreciate that, until the end of each talk, I should say. Okay, so we've got two remote presenters today. So our first presenter is Matt Parent, who is presenting all the way from Australia. So it's a different time for him. So let me see here. I'm going to let him share his screen. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to. Thank you, Margaret. Okay, Matt, I will let you introduce your presentation and go ahead and get started.
Great, so everyone can see my screen, correct?
Sorry, Matt, I was muted. Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Matthew Parent, and my project was incorporating the physical constraints of the total water supply into the Great Lakes hydrologic model. So a little bit about me. I did my BS in math and BA in religious studies from Stanford University. I just graduated from the University of Michigan with a Master's of Applied Data Science a couple months ago, and I just started another Master's in Environmental Science at the University of Melbourne a couple weeks ago. Just finished week 3. So my project mentors for the project were Yi Hong, Lauren Fry, and Dani Jones, and big thanks to the whole BIL SA team that I worked with. It was great to join on the meetings, present to you all, and hear some of the great work that you guys are doing and contribute a little bit to that. So a little bit about the BIL SA project, for those who don't know, it's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law from a handful of years ago. It has to do with water level forecasting in the Great Lakes. Takes a lot of different domains like atmospheric science, hydrology, data science, research engagement, and social science. My work had to do with the hydrology and data science aspect of that. And overall, the goal was to advance water level forecasting in order to provide accurate forecasts to all the stakeholders in the region, whether it's for economic measures or for coastal planning, public safety, public housing development, that kind of thing. And so a little bit about the modeling project. So the water cycle is a big component of it. So understanding that is critical to being able to predict water levels in all of the Great Lakes. The simple equation is basically supply equals inflow minus outflow plus runoff plus precipitation and minus evaporation. So that those last three terms, are part of what we call net basin supply, which is another critical component of this. Whereas inflow and outflow are kind of easy to control. Think of like Soo locks or canals, that kind of thing. The net basin supply are where a lot of the unpredictability lies, and that's where these Great Lakes levels can vary. And my personal project focused on the runoff component of net basin supply. So a little bit more about the watersheds. As you all know, vast networks of rivers feed into each lake, making up a watershed for each lake. And many of these rivers have gauges, so we're able to kind of see how much the volumetric levels of water that flow through these rivers. However, a lot of rivers all across the world really don't have gauges. They're ungauged, and this is a contemporary pressing issue in hydrology research. We call it predicting ungauged basins. So whereas you can see a gauge here on a river, although many look different, there are a lot that don't have gauges. So my work aims to kind of address this problem through modeling river discharge in areas where we do have gauges, and hopefully understanding these ungauged basins will be able to help us predict and estimate runoff and then water levels in the Great Lakes. So a little bit of background on the type of modeling that I'm doing. They're called long short-term memory models. So in 2019, a paper was published that kind of showed the potency of these LSTMs, as we call them, where in the paper they outperformed the standard process-based modeling for hydrology and engaged basin prediction. So they're a type of recurrent neural network, which are deep learning methods that are really effective for sequential data. You see them a lot in natural language processing, but here we're using them for time series data. I use two types of LSTMs, the standard one and then what we call entity aware, which kind of just adds some like stochastic variation into some certain attributes that are used in model training. I'll say one more thing about the model. It's pretty complex, but a cool component is it has what's called a memory gate that allows the model to retain certain information, discard information it deems unworthy as it trains on these input sequences. So some of the data that I used for model training, we used a set of 1,088 subbasins across the whole Great Lakes region. Some came from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Others came from the USGS. I used time series data from the Climate Forecast System Reanalysis dataset, and I used fractional mapping to map it onto each basin. The resolution is kind of large for the CFSR, so this fractional mapping was important. And lastly, a little bit more about the LSTMs. We fed them time series data from the CFSR dataset, as well as some static physical attributes. And I'll get into both of these in the next couple of slides. And then we use various parameters in the LSTMs. An important one is what we call look back, which if the model's trained on daily data, we can set a look back for maybe 365 days. So it looks back 365 instances to predict the next single day. You can do it for months or years as well. So some of the time series variables that I used for the model, they covered the period 1980 to 2023. You have wind components, humidity, min-max temperatures, radiation, precipitation, and so on. Whereas static variables, which are supposed to be more unchanging and weren't included in the time series, but this is kind of where the entity aware component comes in more for these static variables. You have physical attributes like the slope of the ground, the land cover makeup, soil makeup, and so on. And so focusing more, so the basins I mentioned before that I trained the model on were this left-hand side, the 1,000 basins we called them. And these are a lot of basins in the Great Lakes, whereas from the large basin runoff model on the right side, larger basins and fewer of them. And so our goal is to hopefully train the model on the left side to test on the LBRM basins, which will hopefully let us predict runoff into the Great Lakes. One thing to note also is that every LBRM basin runs directly into a lake, while the 1,000 basins might not necessarily run into the lake. They might run into another basin before making it to the lake, which is something to keep in mind for model training. So the tasks and goals. First, I train the models on daily time series data. I do use both temporal and spatial-based train test splits. So for instance, for temporal, train on 1980 to 2015 and test on 2016 to 2023 data, whereas spatial would be the predicting ungauged basins, and you train on a set of basins and test on a different set of basins that we withhold from training. And the goal for this was proof of concept and also comparing the efficacy of LSTMs versus entity-aware LSTMs. Next, the next goal would be to focus on monthly time series data, so consolidate the daily to monthly, and this fits more in with the BILSA project, which takes monthly inputs and makes monthly forecasts. For this, I only focused on predicting ungauged basins and really spent a lot of time optimizing all the different parameters that go into the model to try and get the best model possible for this. And then lastly, what I mentioned the slide before, we want to train these models on the 1,000 basins and then run it on the large basin runoff model basin set to try and estimate the total runoff that goes into the Great Lakes. So I mentioned this, but so for the temporal models, we used the data from 1980 to 2015 to train and then tested on the remaining time period. And we used any discharge data available. Whereas for spatial models, we trained on 90% of basins and tested on a withheld 10% on the whole time period. And for this, I only used basins that had at least 20% of discharge values present. And I standardized and normalized the data as I trained and tested the model. One thing to note from this is I normalized the discharge data by basin size to keep it more robust to the varying basin sizes, because maybe large basins or small basins could affect model training too much. And then lastly, before we get into the results, some evaluation metrics that I took into account. The most common hydrology evaluation metric for estimating discharge in ungauged basins is the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, which overall just gives a good measure of the variance in model accuracy. A perfect value is 1, 0. It goes into the negatives, but 0 is basically estimating the mean is equal to a level of 0. Klein-Gupta efficiency is some consider enhanced version of the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency. Also, 1 is a perfect value. And it combines 3 metrics into one: correlation coefficient, variability ratio, and bias ratio. And lastly, took percent bias into account, and this will give us an idea of whether the model is overestimating water discharge or underestimating water discharge. So first, I trained on the daily data. So for the temporal-based model training, so I should give a little more context. Good NSE and KGE values, usually above 0.4, 0.5 is better, and 0.6, 0.7 get to be really good. So here we got the best performing models were around the lower 0.5s, 0.52 NSE, 0.6 KGE, and 0.1 for p-bias. And initial results actually showed that the standard LSTM performed better than the EA LSTM. And you can see the chart on the bottom left kind of showed the results as the model trained, whereas on the right were the final outputs of the model. The map gives some context. Some of those larger basins on the Georgian Bay were worse performing than the rest. Then for spatial-based modeling, we had a median NSE of 0.51, median KG of 0.55, and percent bias of 0.07. And initial results showed this time that the entity-aware LSTM performed better than the standard LSTM, which is something to consider when comparing spatial-based versus temporal-based model training. Next, we move to the monthly data. And here, I spent a lot of time training a lot of models to optimize all the hyperparameters. I found that a learning rate of 0.001 performed best. Interesting batch sizes of 96 had the best performing models. And sequence length, which was the look back that I was talking about, didn't seem to have much of an impact. And all of the models actually overestimated water discharge, which is important to note as we move forward. For the best performing model from this optimization, I did a 10-fold cross-validation split, so trained and tested the model on all possible permutations of the data. This is to ensure robustness and that the model actually performs as it should. And we saw that the monthly models performed much better than the daily models. You can see that the NSE was 0.66, KG 0.71, and percent bias 0.08. And these are the mean values across all 10 models that were trained. So this is very encouraging results. You can see here the map of the NSE and the percent bias. Some basins and some of the larger basins along Lake Superior and the Georgian Bay again probably performed a little worse, but you can see some dark blue in the lower peninsula in general, and showing some great performance. And on the right side, you can see some of the actual large basins were underestimated, while the worst performing small basins were overestimated. Here's just some histograms of the basin performance. Seeing a large concentration around 0.7, 0.8 is encouraging. Percent bias around 0 is also encouraging. Something interesting to take note was comparing performance between basins in the US and Canada. The data were collected differently, and water systems are different in the countries. So this just gives some context to how we might want to train models in the future or use the data in the future. But it looks like the USA kind of had less variance in both NSE and percent bias estimations. And lastly, not necessarily some super interesting results in basin size and dominant land cover, but just for context, you can see most of the basins were small, and in land cover, most were cultivated and managed areas, but you can see in tree cover, broadleaf, deciduous, closed, you had a lot better performing basins to worst performing basin ratio. So that's something to keep in mind moving forward. And so lastly, step 3 is moving on to predicting total runoff. It's taking this model that I spent all summer training and putting it onto the LBRM basin set. And unfortunately, it did not transfer very well. Something we're still working through, but we don't have discharge values for the LBRM basins, but we do have total runoff into the lakes. So we aggregated all the estimated or the model predictions for these LBRM basins and compared it to the L2 runoff values. And interestingly, Lake Ontario performed extremely well with the NSE 0.77%, bias 0.09, whereas the other three lakes were pretty dreadful. So confusing results. We're not really sure what went wrong. If you look at like average basin size, number of gauge basins used in training, nothing stands out necessarily as correlating with good performance for Ontario, apart from just seeing that the basin count in Ontario was the least. But yeah, it's something to think of. So as we move on to our next steps, we'll look further into why the LBRM basins didn't perform well. The 1,000 basins were much smaller, so that could be a reason. It's also what I mentioned about every LBRM basin runs directly into a lake. Well, the 1,000 basins didn't necessarily, so we might want to weigh those last basins in the 1,000 basin more heavily. That's something just to keep in mind as we move forward, and then also want to just kind of look more into the comparison of entity-aware versus non-entity-aware long short-term memory models, see what other time series variables we could use, and just push for further in the hyperparameter optimization. But yeah, so that was my work this summer. Final thanks to everyone, my mentors, Yi, Lauren, and Dani, everyone from the BILSA team, Margaret and Mary, and everyone else. You all were very nice and wonderful people, and it was a great experience working with you all. And then the fellows, you guys are all great. I'm really excited to see the work you do as you move forward in your careers. So thanks to everyone.
All right, wonderful. Matthew, we were still muted, so you weren't able to hear our applause, but the whole room applauded for you. And we will now, we've got a few minutes for questions for Matt. And Margaret will bring the microphone around.
Pretty theme song. Any questions? I'm checking online too, that's why I'm off this way.
I don't. Okay.
It's loading. I don't see any questions online. Oh, we got two.
Skip one.
Hey, Matthew, great job. It's Dani. In the couple of minutes you have here, could you elaborate a little bit more on what kind of sensitivity experiments do you think you might do to test why the model didn't transfer over very well to the larger LSTM basins? I know you spoke to it a little bit, but maybe are there specific like sensitivity tests you'd like to do in that along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think sensitivity testing basin size is probably the first aspect. All the predictions in general for the models were overestimations, but they were grossly overestimated in the LBRM set. So having normalized by the basin area kind of biases towards large basins. So it might lead to overestimations in the final outputs. Other sensitivity testing, I guess, yeah, I'm not sure. One variable that we left out was snowmelt, which could be significant, especially as we saw some of the more northern basins were worse performing in the 1,000 basin set. So if we could test for like performance with latitude, that could be something that could lead us to better results as well.
Hey, Matthew, great talk. I have a naive question here from a non-modeler. I imagine when you're training your data set on 1980 to 2015 and then testing it on 2016 to 2023, there could be, climate change over that period that could skew things or make the model not as good as it could be. So I'm wondering if it could make sense to have a more random training and test data set, like even or odd years or something like that, or just to test the model. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I do think that probably could be a good idea. The look back is one thing, so the model only looks back a certain amount of time as it predicts the next. So it should naturally kind of just be more biased to the more recent data in general. But I do agree with you that more randomization could help with the temporal models. But our focus was mainly with the ungauged basins, so the spatial models. But you are absolutely correct. I think that would be a good approach to the temporal models.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. I think that we are going to move on to the next presenter.